This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And now that our recording has officially started, I suppose we can officially begin. It is an honor to have you join us for today's session. I'll say a little bit more about myself and then what we hope to be talking about. I suspect some of the names look familiar in the room. For those who don't know me, my name is Jay Wilgus. I'm a attorney and mediator by training, but spent the first part of my career working in student affairs as assistant dean of students at the University of Utah, and then as director of the Office of Student Conflict Resolution at the University of Michigan. And since 2018, I've operated a specialized law consulting and dispute resolution practice called Clancy Street that focuses exclusively on helping parties find common ground. And so we work on sensitive student, staff, and faculty matters all across the country and partner with the Center for Restorative Justice at the University of San Diego to facilitate and provide restorative justice practitioners where needed, and partner with Fairleigh Dickinson University to provide training and education related to the STARSA programs, which were intended and created to facilitate evidence-based responses to problematic sexual behavior among college students. And so we'll talk a little bit more about all of that today. I am thrilled to be joined by my wonderful colleague, Joan Tabachnik, who I almost am always with when talking about problematic sexual behavior on campus, and Felicia McCrary, who we get to pull in whenever possible to talk with her as well. And so what I'll allow Joan and Felicia to introduce themselves in just a minute, but want to say just a little bit more about what we're going to be talking about today, which is this growing community of folks who find themselves responsible for supporting students who have engaged in problematic sexual behavior. And that work, if you followed our sessions at this conference over the last several years, is expanding, and the number of folks and titles and roles involved is different depending on the campus. And we're looking forward today to sharing more about sort of support resources in that way, as well as some things we've learned along the way from that group of folks who have joined us. As Joan mentioned, if you have not already, it would be great if you could put your name and sort of role on campus in the Whova chat. We'll get to know you a little bit better as Joan and Felicia introduce themselves. Joan, I'll turn to you and then to Felicia.
Great, thank you, Jay. And just it's a pleasure just to be here at Puzzles yet again. I think I've been here for the past 5 years or 6 years, certainly before pandemic. And just to say that I've been working in the field of sexual violence prevention for over 30 years, first focusing on child sexual abuse and the so it made the different approach that we took to child sexual abuse prevention was how to prevent the perpetration of child sexual abuse, and particularly how to prevent the development of those behaviors in children and youth. Then through a fellowship I had with the Department of Justice, so after working like in small nonprofits my entire life, I got a chance to work at the federal level, first under the Obama administration, where there was a focus on campus sexual misconduct, and that's where I met Jay, and particularly the STARS program, and started doing more, focusing on more on what was happening on the campus sexual misconduct. So where I haven't worked on a campus, except in this particular role, I did a number of years ago. But what I really find helpful is that bringing that perspective of perpetration prevention, and how that's something which there's research in the lots of other fields, and sort of trying to bring those fields together, the information, the research that we have working with adolescents, because I see the traditional age students very similar to traditional age campus students. And so bringing that information and research together, and I think in particular I get excited about the Puzzles Conference is because the focus is on victims and survivors, and that's at the root, I think, of the work of the genesis of Puzzles, that I feel incredibly important that we look at working with respondents, working with responsible students through that survivor lens as well. So I think I can go on, but I think that gives enough, and I want to turn this over to Felicia to give a little bit of background introduction to herself.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Joan. Hi, everyone. My name is Felicia McCrary. I use she, her pronouns, and I am coming to you from the University of Michigan within the Office of Student Conflict Resolution, where I serve as the Associate Director. I'm so honored to be here. I love when Jay and Joan ask me to contribute to presentations and the work that is being done, and so I'm happy to be here to share more about the work that we do at the University of Michigan. And you'll hear a little bit about that later through some quotes. But I've been in the Office of Student Conflict Resolution for the last 5 years, and until recently was directly leading out the work of our sexual and gender-based misconduct response programs, which included our informal resolution option under Title IX regulations, which we call adaptable resolution. So a restorative approach to addressing campus sexual harm by bringing parties together to have a hand in meeting needs and discussing how they might want to come to outcomes together in a collaborative and healing centered way. Also, our review and reintegration work. So for students who have been suspended or have taken some time away from the institution and they're seeking to return, we offer a program to evaluate if that is an appropriate step and thinking about what does safety planning and what does accountability look like upon a return to campus and reintegrating safely into the community. And then, of course, our STARSA active psychoeducation program, which has been operating at the institution since 2018. And we have formally brought it into the fold of the work that we do and have been finding new ways to involve individuals both from a facilitative standpoint and also, of course, working with students and finding ways to allow them to enter into the program and work with us in a collaborative way to address problematic sexual behaviors. So excited to be here, and I will pass it to Jay to take us away.
Great. Thank you both. So, thanks to those of you who are chiming in the chat to let us know where you're from and sort of roles you have on campus. If you've not looked there, I'd encourage you to take a peek. We know that folks get interested in this work for any number of reasons. Some come from sort of a victim advocacy background or role. Some come from a Title IX coordinator perspective. Some have been, working to support respondents in different ways, whether on or off campus. And increasingly, I think all of us are noticing that the work we do after a student has been found responsible for problematic sexual behavior, or after they've accepted responsibility for problematic sexual behavior in an informal resolution processes, is critical if we hope to prevent the recurrence of future problematic behavior. And doing that in a really thoughtful, research-informed way is critical. And the number of folks who are doing that is just expanding. And we're coming into this work and, in my estimation, sort of establishing a field that didn't exist before and that is coming into fruition. And so what we hope to do today is share a little bit more about the variety of resources that are currently available for folks who are working with this population of students, and this population being students who have engaged in problematic sexual behavior. We want to tell you more about a recent survey we did of schools that have implemented the STARSA program on their campus and share a little bit more of sort of insights and windows in terms of student satisfaction that students have shared who have completed the program, and then talk a little bit more about what a learning community might look like for this growing population of folks who are working with students who have engaged in problematic sexual behavior. So that's the plan, and we welcome you to engage as much and as often as you can in whichever ways you can. I was chatting with Natalie on the side and understand we might not be able to sort of easily unmute or raise your hand. But if you can find some button that would allow you to do that and want to, we would certainly welcome you to. Natalie and Yuka might be able to help us unmute you for that purpose. Would also welcome you to just put in the chat too and be active in that space as we welcome your voice in the room. But to sort of get us started and remind us a little bit of sort of where we are, wanted to talk a little bit more about the context. And then in just a minute, am going to invite you to put in the chat or unmute yourself. And that context relates to what Robert Prentke and Randall Amity, Mary Koss, and others who are cited in that citation at the end referred to as this perfect storm of risk factors presenting on college campuses that really informs this work. And those risk factors we've talked about before are sort of age of the folks who are abused, the victims, survivors, just the access that folks have on a college campus, and the ubiquity of a sort of social culture, drugs that exist, the recognition that college campuses and environments often have what we call coercion supporting peer groups that condone or permit or even hold up to be modeled sort of rape myths, misogynistic attitudes, and otherwise. And then just this recognition that there's some of this folks engaging in sexual behavior for what could be the first time and beginning to experiment and learn about what works and what doesn't, and where sort of boundaries are in that way. We also know that there can be relatively few protective factors that exist, and that where those pro-social support groups, students aren't always connected to them. But the beauty of college campus, and I think the reasons that so many of us love working on a campus, is the recognition of this coordinated, comprehensive support that exists to leverage the malleability of the sort of emerging adult population and change folks or help folks shift from a problematic course if they choose. So it's really, really important work and really important that we do well. And what we've recognized over time is that things have shifted. So what was described in sort of 2016, 2017 as sort of the perfect storm and risk factors that existed at that time is different in 2025. Similarly, some of those protective factors may have shifted. And so I'd love to welcome your voices into the room and have you put in chat what you may see as sort of new risk factors that have presented themselves over the last, say, 6 to 7 years, along with any sort of newer protective factors that you think might be worth noting and leveraging in this work. So I'm watching the chat, looking down to see who's going to be our first to enter. But please, what sort of new risk factors do you see out there, or new protective factors that might exist? Rachel, thank you so much. Yeah, we've talked a lot, right, about sort of in conference spaces at least, this recognition of choking behaviors, whether it's being sort of modeled in images, videos that folks are consuming online, but it's being replicated in harmful ways. Whitney, thank you. Online incel culture, presidential permission of sexual assault. Amanda, risk factors are all the red pill content on social media. Oh, great. Thank you, folks, for engaging. AI facilitated abuse and its rise on campus, right? We're just on the front end of that. The fact that you can now ask Google in creating a Google slide to generate an image, and it will just generate the image for you is pretty mind-blowing. And then, just the ubiquity of social media and the ways in which some of these things get normalized. Ramona, thank you. Less experience forming healthy in-person relationships and communication. I'm reading, I have two younger kids, and I'm reading The Anxious Generation right now, and, recognizing more and more how folks are relying on WhatsApp, social media, Instagram, TikTok to communicate with one another and are engaging less and less frequently in real time, right? So all these are certainly new since the STARSA program was created, since 2018 or so, for sure, and present as new risk factors, new wrinkles for us to consider. Are there any new protective factors that you're aware of that would be worth highlighting in the other column? Whitney, thank you for adding social anxiety too. Yeah, because that's certainly a piece. Any new protective factors that we should note? Oh, I just navigated away from my chat and didn't see. Online support communities. Yeah, right. We've got more and more places where folks can get support online, even if those spaces aren't always helpful and pro-social. There are spaces that exist, including spaces that exist for parents and students who have caused sexual harm and otherwise. The other things that come to mind on our end, I think uh, it can be sort of obvious, but just this recognition there is a growing community of professionals who are dedicating themselves to supporting students who have engaged in this behavior, right? And recognizing that we can't, as we share in other spaces, simply discard students who have engaged in problematic sexual behavior, expel them from campus and expect them to do well elsewhere, or after a suspension to reintegrate themselves. And that we really do need to support students in a thoughtful way. And so that field and your role in helping create it is really important. I think also the recognition, and Joan, Felicia, please help me if there's oh, thank you. High profile court cases, Whitney says, demonstrating essay is not without consequences, location sharing. I think some of these pieces are also additional risk factors, right? That not necessarily protective factors that exist, but that create complications. But we have new resources that exist, and that's partly what we want to highlight today in terms of not only the growing field, but the growing set of resources that exist to help us do this. And so Joan is going to talk about that in just a minute, but as I want to just conclude this opening section by reminding us that this work is not only important from an evidence-based standpoint, it's really important too from a compliance standpoint. And so the 2020 regulations sort of help prompt and remind us about the importance of equity of the services being provided, and recognize that we, in as much as we have services supporting victims and survivors of problematic sexual behavior, we need to have services that are supporting students who have engaged in this behavior as well. So how we do that looks and feels differently depending on the campuses that we're at, and is guided by any number of resources and relationships that exist out there. And to take us forward, I want to turn it to Joan to talk about some of those resources that are newer on the horizon that you might find useful.
Great, thank you, Jay. And yeah, so I'm going to be talking about three different resources that are out there that are also free in the public domain. And then Jay also will jump in with the fourth resource, which is free around STARSA. But I want to say, like, if you're out there and you're starting a program to work with responsible students, and the term we've been using a lot is responsible students, or students responsible for sexual misconduct. And Jay will explain why that might encompass a wider range of students that you're looking for. But I'm working with it to say that if you're thinking about starting a program, if you're looking for materials or job descriptions, there's no like central place for that. But we thought it might be important and helpful to share some of these resources and highlight some of our favorite ones in particular. So in the next first slide, I want to sort of talk about the Expanding the Frame, which was a survey which was done in 2019, released in 2020 through NASPA. And NASPA really, I think, is leading the way with a lot of reports and a great resource. And this survey was of 251 professionals, were given about 30 different questions. And one of the things that we found was that only 5% at the time, and I say we because I should be full disclosure, I'm one of the authors of this report, that only 5% had at least one full-time employee. And as far as we can say, at least anecdotally, we're not seeing that number increase dramatically over time. That 85% had no budget that specifically was dedicated to respondent services. 41% of them, of that 85, were using volunteer faculty or staff. 7% were using graduate students, and 54% were using sort of outside resources, legal or clinical outside resources. So 85% didn't have any direct dedicated budget. And then what we're finding through all these different studies that there's no consistent location for oversight of these resources. But we found that the Dean of Students and also the Title IX offices tend to be where most of these are located, um, or at least supervising these services. And there's also, the role was also very different from one to another, one campus to another. Two other reports that are available through NASPA in 2023, Maddie Carnes and Lucy Rojas wrote a piece that's really wonderful overview called Five Things Colleges and Universities Can Do to Provide Support Services to Respondents. And then also, most recently, they have a report released by developed by Kyla Martin at Northeastern, which talks about developing a framework for working with students accused of sexual violence, dating violence, and/or stalking in higher education. That one, there is a cost for. It's $199 for members or $299 for non-members. But I think that NASPA is a great place, and I'm not actually able to, but I will put in the chat at least a link to the five things, but you should have that. And the slides will be available so you can get the links to each of these three resources. So the second resource I wanted to talk about was working with respondents that was developed in sexual misconduct cases that was developed by the McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention at the University of Utah. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because Julie Broussard just did a workshop yesterday about this, and it's a fantastic workshop. So if you missed it, you can catch it in the recordings. But basically, what I felt was really important that came from that is that they actually defined what kind of, like it said there, how the services are provided from campus to campus. Well, they defined what kind of differences there are. So they talked about some campuses offering case management or referrals, some providing a psychoeducational program, and others sort of just simply explaining the adjudication process. They talked about sort of relevant philosophies, which I thought was, again, an interesting categorization. We're talking about equity as one framework. Another framework was just responding, of supporting sort of respondent education or learning, just that educational emphasis on learning and growth, bringing a lens of compassion and humanity, and also promoting healing. It's just an interesting frame of how different people would approach this work. And then what really sort of grabbed our attention was also that not only that talked about the essential sources of support, like training, the importance of connecting with colleagues and supervisors, but also emphasized like what's needed, which is essential to have spaces for processing these difficult cases of how do you work with a student who's engaged, who is in denial, those kinds of questions, and a chance to reflect back, am I doing the right approach? Do you have any other ideas? Opportunities for bring just that sort of brainstorming that's non-judgmental between different colleagues. So I would say I'm going to not spend a lot more time on that, but just if you haven't had a chance to look at that report, you can go online or listen to Julia's really fantastic presentation of that material. And then the third report I wanted to talk about, which is actually I'm excited about because this is a sneak preview. And this is a report which should be hopefully coming out in the spring from the Victim Rights Law Center that I'm in the process of actually, my final version is due on Monday. So as soon as we get off, I'm going back to finalize some of those reports. But basically what we did was we interviewed also 15 different campuses and also did two roundtable discussions with 8 different people, just to find out that not just how people talked about it, their campus, but how different campuses talk to each other. And what we found, again, like we're finding in all these other reports, that there's still no consistent location on campus and no consistent role that staff will have with responsible students. But what came out was the importance of collaboration, and both collaboration as an important element to break the isolation that people feel, but also as an opportunity to sort of how do you then actually link students to services. A lot of that seemed to come from like the informal relationships that people had. Also, the collaboration was important in terms of getting leadership support and buy-in. And then what I found was most important was how there was really consensus that one of the key collaborating partners had to be with the survivor services on campus or the advocacy services that are on campus. That in fact, when there wasn't that easy collaboration, that the respondent services tended to be just about this is what the process looks like, just a process consultation. It tended to be much more adversarial. When there was a strong collaboration between services for victims and survivors and people for working with respondents as well, that in terms of that collaboration, there was actually much more creativity and opportunities for restorative justice, alternative resolution processes, and really a process that would be more attentive to what survivors want and need. So that was a really important finding. And then also, again, the need for a community of practice. And in particular, what I found also equally important was that how people talked about in order to actually reach out and do that collaboration, you need to be able to talk about your work. And then how people talked about their work depended in part on who they talked to. And that they actually talked about changing the way they talked about their work depending on the audience, which again was a really fascinating conversation. So one of the things we wanted to just pose to you all is that given it seems like looking through some of the roles that some people actually are in that unicorn of actually looks at least one or two are full-time employees working on this issue, but even if it's part-time or if you're interested, how do you explain this work, whether it be your work or the work of others who work with responsible students? How do you explain that work to others? I'm curious if you could just put in the chat just on the ideas of how you address that, especially if you're talking about to a colleague on your campus who may or may not be have a positive response to what you're trying to do. So if you could just take a moment and just put into the chat how you would talk about this. And maybe while we're waiting for that, want to just sort of talk about that. What we also heard um, was just sort of certainly the language that people used would change, but also the importance of listening to your potential partner, um, finding out what their needs are and where's the common ground between them. So as you speak of the overlap, it may be like the lens that we talked about right up front of equity. It may be some of the relevant philosophies that came from the Utah report about safety. That might be the key concern if you're talking to as one of your potential partners of the safety team on campus. Maybe talking about reducing risk if you're talking to the legal counsel, if you're talking about healing, or if you're talking to survivors about the importance of this never happening again. So we heard from a lot of different folks about that. And I'm just wondering, just in terms of maybe given our timing, Jay and Felicia, maybe what I'll do is we'll move on, but just sort of keep that question in mind of how do you explain your work to others? Actually, we have a couple of people did respond. So basically, I have to take my glasses off to read this now. Basically, Hope, thank you, said I explain my work by saying that I work with students who are named as having caused harm. I explain that part of my role is to help them walk through this policy and processes, but also help ensure that they are okay as they are going through the stressful process that can be isolating to them. Thank you. Thank you, Hope. 'Cause I think that again, people often talk about and don't realize that sometimes even that the leaning towards the possibility of suicidality when people are actually being accused and they're getting shamed and isolated from their campus. Also, um, just want to just sort of say that I think Hope you're sort of speaking to like some of the importance of like the language that we might use together as professionals, and then some of the language you might be using externally. So, for example, what I heard internally in the roundtables about the importance of a non-judgmental approach. But when people hear that outside this work, they might hear like, well, where's the accountability? So non-judgmental doesn't mean that there's not um, accountability, but it's talking about how do you maybe the term might be used outside, be more how do you have a not dehumanizing as opposed to non-judgmental, because we want to make sure that accountability is part of those conversations. So it's complex, and I think that's what I wanted to just highlight is that as you talk to them, listen to your audience and think about the language you're using and how that language is heard. So I'm going to pass this back over to you, Jay. One more slide, just to say that one thing we like to think about is that framing the problem is really key to resolving a problem, and that we need new frames if we want to get new answers. So that if we frame this as I think, if go back again 20, 30 years, we talk about the undetected rapist. We were kind of giving this idea of a monster, but that's what we needed to use and to name in order to get people's attention. But if you're monsters, then the only people who can actually confront a monster is like a superhero. And that means it's hard to get bystander engagement. So if we talk about these being complex human beings, that people that we know, we're going to have a different kind of response. So framing the problem can give you a new answers. And an example I always like to give is that there's a group called Frameworks. And when I first heard them talking, this was again, I'm dating myself again, many years ago before we had gay marriage, and they asked people, do you believe in gay marriage? That it was something like 30 to 40%. But if you asked and changed the question and said, do you believe that the government has a right to tell you what to do in the bedroom? Then you're going to get 90%. So how you frame a question has a huge impact on how people will answer. So Jay is going to jump to a little bit how we'd like to frame, like Clancy Street, some of the issues here. So passing it back to you, Jay.
Yeah, great. So yeah, that framing makes a big difference, right? And in some ways, I perceive us to be involved in a sort of a collective reframing of what this work involves and who it involves across the campus and different time points, and a recognition that to comprehensively address problematic sexual behavior, we all have to be working on the same page and have a common mission in mind to eliminate and prevent sexual violence to the greatest extent possible. And recognizing that the roles we play in doing that work differ, and that the ways in which problematic sexual behavior presents to us differs, including the reality that we're not capturing currently all of those presentations. And so this slide is intended to just capture what Joan and I refer to as these buckets, these potential opportunities for proactive research-informed involvement, which proceeds on the left side from students who might have risk factors for engaging in problematic sexual behavior, but who haven't yet, right? So that's a great point at which to highlight, that they're sort of are hearing sort of rape supportive myths or misogynistic attitudes or involvement in coercion supporting peer groups, and interrupt cycles that could lead to problematic sexual behavior. Bucket two is intended to capture there's been problematic behavior, but it had not been reported to campus yet, and ways in which we might be able to invite those students to acknowledge that they have caused harm or may have caused harm, and work to make it right without having to be reported to campus. And then buckets 3 through 5 sort of recognize that there's a grievance procedure that's underway, including that critical point at bucket 3 where there's been a report and we have to engage in some risk and safety analysis to determine whether or not emergency removal is needed, and a recognition that students may be removed from campus, and simply being found responsible or being removed from campus doesn't mean that all is well, that you won't engage in this behavior again. Neither does it mean that if you're found not responsible in bucket 4B, that everything's fine, that we're not concerned about your behavior. And so the ways in which you might be personally involved with these matters on campus depends on your role, right? And we require our team members to engage thoughtfully with folks who engage in this behavior as well, and recognize that in so doing, we must constantly be mindful of the ways in which the behavior has impacted the survivors, victim survivors, and ways in which the community may need to be involved as well. And so our work, today is focused on the sort of that blue center line, center layer, but is mindful of the impact in our work in other spaces. So the resource that Joan mentioned that some of you may be aware of, and I'm going to make an assumption. I wish there was an easy way for you to give me a thumbs up to say, yeah, are you familiar with STARSA or not? But I don't think there is. So I'm just going to make the assumption that some of you are familiar and some of you are not. But STARSA is a key resource we think for you to know about because it remains the only federally funded resource that exists that we're aware of that was created to with a risk assessment component and a corresponding treatment and psychoeducational intervention for students who have been found responsible for sexual misconduct. And so we can share plenty more about that program as you'd like, but it's important to know that it exists out there and that it includes both these therapeutic and educational interventions, recognizing that some behavior is broad enough there's a subset of the behavior that can be addressed by sort of remedying knowledge-based deficits and some behavior that and risks and needs that present in a way that really does require a clinical intervention from a licensed mental health provider of some sort. And so the STARSA programs have those two flavors, one of which we call active psychoeducation, can be provided by lots of folks on campus. Another is the CBT version, which must be provided by a clinician. So both are useful and target relevant risks and need domains and seek to leverage student-specific protective factors. Those programs come with a set of supplemental materials, videos, experiential exercises, selected readings, out-of-session assignments, which were static when finalized in 2018. And we've taken great joy in helping, in many thanks to Felicia's help, building an expanding resource library for folks who are utilizing the STARSA materials that provides additional resources for not only respondent students or participants, but for facilitators as well. So if you're looking for more information about that, sadly, it is no longer on the NCJRS website where it once was as a result of Joan and my good trouble foyering it into the public consciousness, but it has now been taken down. But you can still find it on our website at clancystreet.com/STARSA-resource-toolkit, and happy to share it there. I was I have not yet told Joan this, but was very pleased to get a call last night from a clinician in El Paso who was trained on the CBT program under the original pilot program years ago, who was eager to utilize the CBT program and could not put her hands on her materials and was wondering where she could find it, and did some Googling and found that Clancy Street and my name popped up, and she says, I know him, I'm going to call him. So I had a great conversation with her and happy to connect you all with those resources as well. I think the last thing I want to mention before turning it over again is just that we are happy to provide support and training. And so some of you may be on our mailing list already for webinars we've been conducting and will continue to do in the future that address this topic and may be of interest to you. Happy to provide training on the AP or the CBT program, and very gladly support this growing community online with support and resources. And if you're interested and would like to make a referral to have a student complete the STARSA active psychoeducation program, we also offer facilitation services in that way and can provide the program, the AP program, for you. So please let us know if we can do that. So having said that and sort of covered the resources that Joan mentioned, noting the STARSA program, I want to explain more about what we've come to learn from those who are utilizing the STARSA program and actively engaging in this work. And so I'll turn it to Joan for that part.
Thank you. And just maybe just go back to the slide 1 second, Jay, the previous slide, and just say that because there is no central learning community, we're trying to do our best to sort of have a forum where people can share information. So we have these free webinars that we're hosting. The next one we're doing we just did one about protective factors with Kevin Powell, that really sort of dived into some of the research of what we know about protective factors, particularly given that there's so many more risk factors. But I think that we do need to get a deeper dive into what are the protective factors that are available. The next one is going to be the end of January, talking about the manosphere and what does it mean to be a good dude is the title of it. So you can find that information on the Clancy Street website. If you sign up, we promise we don't blast you with too many like sales type things at all, but we try to share resources. And if you participate in one of our programs, you also can join the listserv, which is a chance for people to exchange information. So we're trying as much as possible to create that kind of exchange. And we really welcome anyone here on this call to also sort of join us. So as Jay said, we wanted to say, like, given that we've been doing this, what are some of the things that we've been learning? And we want to talk about both in terms of the survey that we have did recently in terms of our implementation survey, but also Felicia's here to share some of what we're hearing from the students who are actually going through the process. We feel like that's something which, again, we don't hear very much about. So in the next slide, Jay, if you can see that the implementation survey is really where we talked about first about the original pilot sites that we were able to talk to. We also, Jay, if you can flip to the next slide, that also the different campuses that we've trained through our virtual trainings. We've had we had 5 of them now between 2024 and 2025. And then we also have gone on a campus. And since you're in North Carolina, we've actually both UNC and Duke are 2 of the campuses that we've trained. But we found that mostly it's either large campuses or well-endowed campuses who can actually bring a team of folks to actually do a full campus training. So that's why the online trainings we found were so important to offer. And we've trained now 133 individuals on 60 different campuses. When we did this survey, we heard from about 19% of those, and to say that 75% of the people who did respond were mostly coming from our virtual training campuses. So in the next slide, to show that what we looked at is like when we asked about success, when we just sort of described success, 75% said that they had made some progress since the training. And since we know that a one and done doesn't work, we wanted to find out like what else we could provide also for to provide support. So we do provide a 6-month check-in for free. As I said, we also have the webinars and we have a chance for campuses that we've trained to talk with each other. But what we sort of divided up in terms of what they saw as progress is that they 90% after the training, you had talked to a key stakeholder. And I should say that a number of, I think it was 20% of the folks who responded had been in our August training. So the fact that they haven't progressed as much makes sense given that we did this survey last month. But 89% said they've actually talked to some of the key stakeholders, and 60% said they had the support of those key stakeholders, which is an important difference. It might be talking to them and in conversation, but do you have the full support of them? 78% said they had a trained facilitator on campus that they felt qualified to speak with students, and 78% said they had a student referred to them. And then 40% said that they actually had completed their working with a student. So again, the incomplete numbers don't necessarily mean that they won't complete them. It means that just like maybe they haven't finished that whole process, which we usually see takes between 8 and 12 sessions, sometimes a little bit more. In the next slide, we ask this question here of whether students have been referred, and in that question of whether they've been referred, that just say that actually, given the timing, I'm just going to skip to the next slide, Jay, which is basically sort of showing that in the next slide that other people, how people are referred, that 93% said that they were referred by sanctions. But I really thought it was impressive that also 70% said that they were referred to by informal resolution process. And then even more remarkable, which I thought was really helpful, was that 21% were referred by a self-referral. So this is somebody who came forward voluntarily. And that what we found was that, that basically that when we asked the question of how many students have been referred, that 30% said that at more than 11 students, we had, a number of different groupings of one or two to three, four to five. But we found that basically that 30% of those were from 11 or more students. So it shows that some of these programs have been very, very robust, at least a third of those. So we asked the final question of sort of like, what other resource that Clancy Street or that you would be looking for to support implementation? And we said that it would be helpful to have, one person responded, said it would be helpful to have more opportunities to talk in group settings or have more time in trainings to talk through implementation. It is interesting to watch the gaps that you don't know about being highlighted. So when we asked that question of what else you need, but I love that this person was sort of talking about you don't always know what you don't know, and that having those conversations, having an opportunity to hear what other schools are doing, what other programs are doing, is an essential piece of sort of our own learning, our own creating. Sort of I think of this field, this approach to working with responsible students. And one thing I would like to say is that, like, one I think want to offer the chance for us in terms of learning community before we jump to Felicia to hear from the respondents themselves. I'm curious from like, what would you like to see in this field? Certainly, that's something that you came up in the McCluskey Center study that came up in this survey that from NASPA. We have sort of our own ideas as well, but I'd be curious from you if you put it in the chat. What would you like to see in this field? What are you looking for? And I think that one of the things that we've heard is sometimes is just have a place like when I talked to one campus, um, where someone was given the job of starting it and they couldn't even, they used the developing the frame to find out at least what campuses are doing more broadly, but even finding a job description was hard to locate. So if you could just put in maybe the chat, what would you like to see in this field? What would be helpful to you as you think moving forward in the kind of in this work with working with students responsible for sexual misconduct? And I'm always just like, that moment of sitting with the silence on a Zoom. Somehow I can do that in a room with people, but on Zoom it feels really dysregulating. So please put something in the chat here.
I will note as folks
Okay.
are thinking that Joan and I and others have had like plenty of ideas about what might be helpful, but really curious to hear um, what you all have. And I see Hope has chimed in there, Joan.
So thank you, Hope. I appreciate you jumping in here. So this is a case debriefs or example cases to see how respondent support is provided. I think that's been one of the richest kinds of conversations is realize that there's no one way to work with a student and there's no one right answer. So having a chance to really talk through what one is doing, and I think that what one person sort of answered in one of the surveys was providing a space for creative problem solving. And thank you, Ramona, for sort of training for colleagues around the campus on restorative justice practices. Yes, sort of to having to be the only person on campus who's talking about in a different way of approaching working with, as opposed to just the formal adjudication process, but getting that buy-in. And I know that Julia talks sort of really wonderfully eloquently about how there really was, like, in her case, a perfect storm to actually develop respondent services, and how that there was a push for restorative justice practice. There was a new clinical practice that was starting in New Orleans, and so how that there was this perfect storm that allowed her to move forward. So having that sort of training of colleagues is so essential, and maybe not always just from you. Also, thank you, Danielle, for understanding how to do this work while still being survivor-centered. And that really is the challenge, especially when if you don't have that collaboration between responsible parties services and survivor services as well. But having that, keeping that victim-centered is always is first and foremost, but also listening and understanding the impact this has on the student who has been accused, and understanding the difference if you're talking about someone who is I would say, a high status senior who is consciously looking for vulnerable freshmen, or if you're talking about another freshman or somebody who's on the spectrum who doesn't really understand the implications of what they've done, how you work with those students are going to be very, very different. And how the students respond will be also different, which I think seems like a great segue to turn this over to Felicia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joan. Um, I am so excited. I get to do one of my favorite things, which is talk about the direct impact that the STARSA program has had on students. So get excited. I want to share a couple of quotes with you from students who have directly participated in the STARSA program. These students are specifically students who have gone through an investigative resolution process. But I want to name, kind of in the implementation survey, there was a question about, different routings to STARSA. And we at Michigan see folks come to us through adaptable resolution, so they're agreeing to participate, and also self-referrals as well. But again, these students in these quotes are coming from a finding of responsibility through a Title IX adjudicative process, and so they are asked to participate in STARSA in a different way. And I hope that as we go through these quotes, it's a grounding reminder that our work isn't only about reducing future risk, although we know that's crucial. It's about supporting students' capacity to learn and change. So the first quote here, this captures what we hear from many of our students, and it's that this program is not just a sanction, not just a requirement, but it is a turning point. This student particularly talks about gaining language that they didn't have before. Many students who cause harm have never been taught to talk about or navigate consent, emotional regulation, perceptions, healthy relationship expectations. And so this program gave the student frameworks and space for reflection that they never had in high school or college, which is things that we probably have heard from many of the students that we have worked with across our campuses. Another thing that stands out to me and is this image this student shares of a door that they didn't know existed. And that's what structured interventions can do. They expand a student's sense of what healthy and accountable behavior looks like. And, we talk a lot about healthy, intimate sexual relationships, but we also talk a lot about peer relationships as well. So just naming that, kind of the span and scope of healthy relationships is broad in what we are able to talk to and reflect on through this STARSA program. And also the commitment that the student expresses to carry this work forward. As they're thinking about one they'll be committed to for life. And I recognize that this is what so many of our campuses want to do, but it can struggle to achieve in thinking about how is this work being carried forward. And I think having a space that is educational and not purely punitive, one that is collaborative, one that walks alongside a student in an individualized way, it creates the space to make this possible for students to carry this work forward to their peers and colleagues at the university and beyond. We can go to the second quote. This quote is one that I personally I just love. They're incredibly honest about their emotional experience of entering into the intervention that is the STARSA Active Psychoeducation Program. They describe starting the program as daunting and even terrifying. And that resonates with what many folks, both here, our practitioners and facilitators of STARSA, have seen, and folks I've talked to around different institutions that have implemented. Students often begin from a space of fear, of defensiveness, or shame. But what I love about this quote is what comes next. This student frames completing the program as the best possible thing that could have happened at that point in my life. And for me, this is not language of obligation, but rather language of growth. They talk about learning communication skills, understanding their own emotions, and developing self-awareness, skills that we know reduce recidivism and support pro-social behaviors. And importantly, the student acknowledges that the learning continues even after the formal participation ends. That's the long-term impacts we aim for, not just finishing sessions, but building internal motivation for healthier decision-making moving forward. And this is a powerful reminder for me, for us, that even students who have caused harm can grow in profound ways when given the structure and the support to do so. I want to share one more quote with folks. This highlights something that practitioners sometimes underestimate, and it's the importance of how we show up with students. The student says, "I never felt shamed or out of place." Which is remarkable in this context. Shame-based approaches don't change behaviors. They often drive it underground or into the dark. But the student felt held in a space that balanced accountability with compassion and dignity. And they also are able to acknowledge causing harm. And in the same sentence, they name accountability as something they are actively holding with support from both the STARSA program, their facilitator, and OSCAR, which is the Office of Student Conflict Resolution. And to me, this is what trauma-informed developmental work looks like. Students are not excused from responsibility, but they also aren't being cast out. They're supported in learning how to understand what happened, repair where possible, and move into healthier patterns. This balance, compassion without minimizing harm, is core to why these programs matter. So that's, just a few of the examples that we have of, how students are conceptualizing this work as they have gone through and completed the STARSA program. And I want to come back to us, to the practitioners doing this work. I recognize that this is hard work. It involves holding harm, supporting student growth, navigating institutional pressures and politics, and often doing so without a clear playbook or a consistent campus home. And so there is another quote that I want to share with you all from a Safer Society survey, and it reads, the best self-care may happen when we are with others and are working to improve our circumstances. And this, to me, is a reminder that sustainability in this field doesn't come from individual resilience alone. It comes from the community. And this is something that Jay and Joan have shared throughout this presentation. Myself included, practitioners often describe feeling a sense of isolation, or like they're the only person on campus who understands or is moving the work in a particular direction. But this is just a reminder that when people doing this work come together, share approaches, talk through cases, support one another, the emotional burden becomes more manageable, and the quality of practice can improve both for ourselves and for our students. And to me, as someone who has been doing this work at the university for a number of years, this is one of the strongest arguments for me for having a learning community and being in spaces, where there are chances to come together to talk through cases, to receive training, to dive deeper into implementation, to think about, what are all of the different ways that folks have implemented STARSA on their campuses, and are there things that we can adopt? It supports not just the professional effectiveness, but also the sustainability of our programs. And so what I'm gonna do is pass it back to Jay to bring us into a bit more of the discussion about what do we need in this work.
Great. Thanks, Felicia, and thanks for sharing those quotes. I think it, to the point made earlier about case studies and examples, it really helps bring it to life when folks can understand. And, maybe it would be worthwhile for us to consider next year's conference or sometime sooner in a webinar, perhaps, to sort of share a real life case study of how this works and more about sort of the interventions involved, the people on campus who are involved in supporting the student, and sort of what's generally known about outcome. So we should think about that. But to transition us back, and for folks that might be sort of wrestling with this notion of respondent support services for the first time, or hearing Joan, Felicia, or I talk for the first time, I want to recognize that sometimes in talking about how we do this work in research-informed ways, by supporting students, by utilizing quotes like that, some folks can come to perceive us as sort of offender defenders, or as uninterested in accountability, or anti-separation, suspension, or expulsion. To the extent any of those thoughts have entered your head, I want to just dispel that notion and recognize that we are pro-effectiveness and want to have you all and campuses utilizing the best available support services that exist out there, and recognize that sometimes campuses will need, and the behavior warrants, removal from a campus. We just can't expect that sort of removing someone from a campus will do anything to cause that student to refrain from engaging that behavior in the future. And our interest is in really making sure that that behavior stops to the greatest extent possible. So that work is complicated, right? How it gets done is complicated. Danielle Bickford, I really appreciate what you put in the chat a little bit earlier. That's also really complicated about how, and important to consider how we do that work in a way that remains survivor-centered. And so if you think back on those string of buckets, the reason we sort of try to emphasize it in that way is to say, listen, we're going to be talking about the center string, but survivors and victims have to remain at the top of our consciousness and following their needs and interests as we proceed in that way. So that is critical. I also put in the chat just some additional thoughts that came out of that Utah report that may be helpful to reflect on, but want to invite your input again to sort of, what do you think you need to increase your connections in this space, to strengthen community, and ultimately to sustain your work in this space? And when I say your work, I recognize that not everyone is serving as a respondent support service provider who's listening, but you may know the folks on your campus who are, who maybe even have a sort of a fractional portion of their full-time effort that is dedicated to respondent support services, or you may just have opinions about it from a victim advocacy perspective. And I'd love to hear from you, if you're able to put in the chat what you think is needed on the questions that you see on the screen there to increase your connection, strengthen community, and sustain your work. So please do enter in the chat if you have thoughts on that.
As folks are adding things to the chat or figuring out how to unmute, I'm happy to share some insights in our office. So we work a lot with our Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center, or SAPAC, on campus, which has both prevention education services and survivor advocacy services. And so we regularly have touch points with folks on both sides of the SAPAC house. Whether that is as student support, people who come to different parts of processes. I'm thinking about adaptable resolution. I'm thinking about, sharing, what resources are available to students, recognizing that SAPAC is a confidential resource. And so, we have touch points where we talk about what themes we are seeing. On the prevention education side, I'd say we have even more touch points with folks who are doing the work, both in updating our STARSA materials to ensure that we are in alignment with what, we as an institution are talking about, what kind of language we are using around topics of consent, of healthy relationships, so that we can have, a bit of dosing as students are going through orientation and going through, different opportunities here at Michigan. We have gotten to a point where folks are also, we're including STARSA facilitation as part of job responsibilities for folks who are hired in prevention education spaces, or also in our fraternity and sorority life. In different spaces on campus. So, that could be something as you are hiring folks in. Is there an opportunity to even just be trained on what STARSA is, to have some general awareness of a resource, and perhaps one day moving towards facilitating and supporting the program in a different way? So there's a couple of thoughts for what we've done.
Great. Thanks, Felicia. Joan, did you want to say a little
Yeah,
more?
just I think maybe just to also add in that two things. One is that to me that one of the key things that very rarely gets asked by institution is like, what does the survivor want? And that or that that what the institution is offering. I heard this wonderful quote that often the survivors, that institution will say offer, door number one or door number two, but they won't actually say, like, what do you want? What would be your dream behind door number three? And that in institutions, like, again, no institution I can say is perfect, but certainly like where I see, like in Michigan, and a few other places where there is that conversation between the different services that allows people to say, well, not just door number one or door number two, meaning criminal justice or reporting on campus adjudication, but like door number three, what does the survivor want? And it opens the door to something like restorative justice, options, alternative resolution options. I think Rachel King is on this group here today, and so if you haven't heard her speak, she's speaking later today. But I think that allows that question of what does the survivor want, and that's how can be integrated into the responsible services, there's responsible student services on campus. So that's at least one of the things I think that there is in the ideal world, a really important integration. And that's not going to work for every student, every campus, but that kind of is the ideal I think that we can move towards. And then the other thing I just wanted to raise in terms of the questions here is that one of the things that we wrestle with is that it seems that on the campuses that again we've worked with that it takes often sort of like some individual's passion to open up the door to responsible services, and that it takes a while for that to be sustained. I think a good example is that I think there's 8 different pilot programs. The original starts a project, and really only one of them is still operating. And so the question we have is like, is there ways that you as practitioners in the field, what you need to help sustain your work? And certainly I would say funding would be, we can say funding absolutely would be fantastic. But do you have any sort of thoughts or insights? Because that's something that we're always looking for, is that how do we strengthen that community support and how do you sustain your work? I'm wondering if you do have any thoughts or insights around that. And this is again one of those things that's hard to do on Zoom. That would be really wonderful to be sitting in a room together and actually having that conversation. So well, I just put that out there one more time, rather than having just the three of us talking at you.
Thanks, John. So pending some additions there, if you have thoughts, we welcome them. I think one of the things that may have become evident in our time here today and you're thinking about this topic, is that folks do have different roles. I want to highlight again Ramona's question, sort of a curiosity from her vantage point about sort of how many folks in this room work in advocacy services and work with responsible students. If you do, what percent of your time is working with responsible students? So recognition that, Ramona, it sounds like you might have that dual role and are curious to connect with others. And so if you could, message Ramona or put in the chat and answer that question, that would be great. The other piece that I just want to note as well is a recognition that the way you enter this work is different. And one of the things we've come to really recognize is that there is no centralized training that I am aware of. I don't think Felicia or Joan are aware of that would prepare you to be a respondent support service provider. In contrast to an RJ practitioner or even a victim advocate, where there is more centralized sort of or readily available training options that exist out there. There's not a standardized training to be a respondent support service provider, largely because what that means differs depending on the campus and how much, as Joan said, a campus is willing to invest in that work. Similarly, there's not at least again that I'm not aware of, a sort of a common association, not that there needs to be one necessarily, but a common sort of professional gathering spot for folks who are engaged in this work. And I think that can contribute to some of the isolation that folks feel who are doing this work on campus, and the utility, frankly, of Juliet and Puzzles and NASPA strategies and other places making room for conversations like this as folks figure out how best to do that. And so we certainly appreciate your contributions in that way and your participation in today's sessions. So if you have other questions, we have like 2 minutes left before we need to make sure we're done and that our recording stops on time. So please put your chat or questions in the chat. As we look at those, I'll just let you know that you can most definitely find Joan, Felicia, and I later at any point you would like. And thanks to those of you who were able to engage. Ramona, I understand, yeah, you're just trying to get a sense of how to do more work with respondents in a way that makes sense. I'll read that in a way that makes sense, acknowledging some of the issues that were brought up, like ensuring our constituents understand we're still survivor-centered, not betraying survivors, of course. Understanding how we can even make the time to do this when we're such a small team. Hope will be at NASPA Strategies, terrific. Would love to connect with folks there. Joan and I have been at NASPA Strategies in recent years and won't be this year, and so we'll miss you. But our colleague Joe Zicki will be there and would be happy to connect with those of you who will be present. As Natalie's saying, we welcome your feedback on this session at any point, and we'll be happy to be in touch. I will close and then turn to Felicia or Joan for any parting thoughts, just to thank you again for joining this session, for being part of the conversation, for being part of this growing community of folks that are just interested in this topic, looking for effective methods of addressing this behavior. And thank you for doing that. Joan, Felicia, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I want to say, Ramona, if you want to reach out to us afterwards, be happy to also share maybe what other campuses are doing and maybe some other folks you might want to connect with. So feel free to reach out to us since you have our contact information. And just to say that, again, if you would like to know more about what Clancy Street is doing, and the resource that we've mentioned here today, that Jay and I and Felicia, we feel really passionate about this work and how important it is. So please feel free to reach out to us individually. We can happy to set up a time to talk, and just appreciate how many of you have showed up for this session. I think that it shows a shift that's happening on campuses, and really welcome that your openness to actually thinking about this. So please reach out to us, and thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing you at some of the other sessions that are going on today.
And I'll just emphasize, love getting an email asking to chat and share more about what we do and to learn from you. So please feel free to reach out. And thank you all so much for your time.
Thanks all. See you around.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.